2 knocks. That's all Julian got out of me the night he pointed his champagne flute at me like a loaded gun, grinned for a room full of strangers, and called me a fossil, a man who spent his retirement hunting splinters with a magnifying glass. I set my water glass down and tapped the oak table twice with one knuckle, the same knock I'd give a support column to find out whether it was lying to me, then finished my water and reached for my parka. Chandeliers threw hard yellow light across 200 faces I didn't know. All of them turned toward me for a second, waiting to see what a broken old man does when he's broken in public. Clara, next to him, stared at the tablecloth like she could disappear into the linen. I didn't shout. I didn't stand up and make a scene the way he clearly wanted me to. I walked out into a Calgary night that had dropped to 20 below, and I did not look back at the glass tower rising behind me, the one with his name already bolted to the lobby wall in brushed steel letters. Nobody in that ballroom knew that 10 days earlier, inside that very tower, I'd knocked on a support column with the same 2 fingers and heard the exact same hollow sound. Folks, I want you to sit with that for a second, because I sat with it for a week. Why does a man let himself be humiliated in front of 200 strangers without saying a single word in his own defense? The answer is simple, and it was already sitting on a desk at the Alberta Safety Codes Council, 48 hours old, waiting to detonate everything Julian thought he owned. My name is Gideon Vance. I'm 64 years old, and for 31 of those years I worked as a structural inspector across this province, which means I spent more time underground in rebar cages and half-poured foundations than I ever spent at a desk. My hands remember concrete the way other men's hands remember a piano. There's a smell I never got rid of, burnt Tim Hortons coffee gone bitter on the warming plate, mixed with wet cement, and it still clings to the collar of every jacket I own, no matter how many times my niece Clara washes them for me. Around my neck, on a leather cord gone soft with age, hangs a brass-rimmed inspection loop my father gave me the year I got my ticket. I've worn it every day since. It's not sentimental. It's a tool. I check joints with it, welds, hairline stress and a beam nobody else would think twice about. But it became something else the day I looked through it and saw the thing that would end up unraveling Julian's entire life. I raised Clara myself, ever since her mother, my younger sister, died when Clara was 19. I taught her to check her tire pressure before a prairie winter, to read a lease before she signed it, to never trust a man who talks faster than he thinks. Then she met Julian Hargrove, and every lesson I'd ever given her seemed to evaporate somewhere between his leased Range Rover and his talk of disruption and getting ahead of the curve. He was 38, a real estate developer with a smile built for investor decks, and he was building a luxury residential tower in the Beltline, 22 stories of glass and ambition called the Ashwood, financed partly by his own money and mostly by a group of lenders out of Toronto who did not strike me as patient people. He had married my Clara 2 years ago. I never trusted him. Not because he was ambitious, I don't hold ambition against a man, but because I'd watched him talk over her at every family dinner since the wedding, watched her get smaller in her own kitchen. A week before that gala, I drove out to the Ashwood site with a bag of butter chicken and rice, because Clara had texted me that she hadn't eaten since breakfast, running numbers for Julian's office on a folding table set up in a construction trailer. While she ate, I wandered the site the way I always do, out of habit more than suspicion. I couldn't help it. 31 years doesn't switch off because you're retired. A section of the parking structure's support columns had been poured 2 days earlier, and the surface still had that raw, dull sheen fresh concrete gets before it fully cures. I crouched down, more out of muscle memory than purpose, and brought the brass loop up to my eye. There it was. A hairline crack, fine as a single strand of hair, running along one of the load-bearing columns, the kind of flaw 100 people could walk past and never notice, the kind that means nothing on a warm day in July. I rapped the surface with my knuckle out of pure instinct, the same way you'd thump a watermelon at the grocery store, and the sound that came back wasn't the tight, solid knock of good concrete. It was hollow. Empty in a way that made the hair rise on my arms, because I had heard that exact sound only twice before in my career, both times right before a structure failed. Calgary winters don't forgive weakness. When water works its way into a flaw like that and freezes, it doesn't just sit there, it expands, and it keeps expanding through every freeze-thaw cycle until whatever's holding it together simply comes apart from the inside. I didn't say anything to Clara that day. I told myself I needed to be certain before I frightened her over nothing. I told myself a lot of things that week. So when Julian stood on that stage a few days later with a microphone in his hand, mocking the useless old man with his rusty little magnifying glass, I already knew something he didn't. I knew what was buried inside the bones of his $15 million tower, and I knew that whatever he said to me in that ballroom, whatever the 200 strangers laughing along with him believed about who I was, none of it would matter in the face of what Winter was about to do to his building. That's why I didn't fight back. That's why I finished my water, tapped the table twice, and walked into the cold like a man who already knew how the story ends. I got into my old Ford at the edge of the parking lot, the kind of truck that takes 2 tries to turn over once the temperature drops below -15, and I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, breath fogging up the windshield faster than the defroster could clear it. Behind me, through the rearview mirror, I could see the ballroom windows glowing gold on the 3rd floor of the hotel, tiny figures still laughing, still lifting glasses to a man they thought had everything. I put the truck in reverse. I did not look at the tower going up 2 blocks over, its skeleton lit by work lights even at that hour, crews racing to get ahead of the frost before the ground turned to iron for the season. Somewhere inside that skeleton was a flaw only I had seen, sealed under a fresh coat of concrete and Julian's competence, and 48 hours earlier I had made a decision about what to do with what I knew, a decision I hadn't told a single living soul, not even Clara. The engine caught on the 2nd try. I pulled out onto 17th Avenue with the heater barely warm and my jaw tight, because the real question wasn't whether Julian would ever learn the truth. It was whether the building would hold together long enough for him to. 2 weeks before that night, I hadn't told anyone what I'd heard in that hollow knock. I'd driven straight home instead and called Walter Kowalski, a man I'd worked beside for 22 years before he took a job running quality control at a supplier out past Balzac. Walt still owed me for the summer I covered his shift so he could see his daughter's wedding in Lethbridge, and men like Walt don't forget a debt like that. "Gid, it's 9 o'clock at night," he said when he picked up. "Somebody die?" "Not yet," I said. "I need you to pull a batch record for me. The Ashwood site, Beltline, ordered under Hargrove Developments. I need the mix design they used on the parking structure columns, poured roughly 10 days ago." There was a long pause, the kind that told me Walt already didn't like where this was going. "You're retired, Gideon." "I know what I am. That's a Toronto finance job. You start pulling records on a Toronto finance job, people notice." "Walt. Clara's married into that family." Another pause, shorter this time. "Give me 2 days." It took him 3. When he called back, his voice had the flat, careful sound of a man reading off a printout he didn't want to be holding. The spec called for CSA-rated cold weather mix, air-entrained, the good stuff, the kind that's supposed to survive your freeze-thaw cycles for 50 years. What actually got poured on the lower-level columns is a standard commercial mix, no air entrainment worth mentioning, shipped in from a supplier out of Regina who normally does parking pads and driveways. Somebody swapped the order at the yard. Paperwork's been altered to make it look like the good stuff went in. "Show me," I said. He mailed me copies. I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses and a brass loop both, going line by line under the lamp until 2 in the morning, and by the time I finished I understood exactly what Julian had done. He was short on cash, the Toronto lenders had already pushed back one payment schedule, and a second column pour using the correct spec would have cost him almost $400,000 more than the cut rate mix. He'd made the swap to protect his own bottom line, and he'd buried the change under paperwork clean enough that nobody without 31 years in the trade would ever think to check it. Calgary's freeze-thaw cycle doesn't care about spreadsheets. Water gets into concrete that isn't built to take it, freezes, expands, and every winter it does that a little more violence to the bones of the building until something gives. I called Julian myself the next morning and asked him to meet me. Not at his office, not at the site. I picked a quiet coffee shop on 4th Street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, somewhere he'd have no audience to perform for. He showed up 20 minutes late in a wool coat that cost more than my truck, checking his phone before he even sat down. Gideon. Make it quick, I've got investors at 11. I slid the folder across the table. You need to stop the pour on the lower parking structure and pull out what's already gone in. All of it. He didn't open the folder. He glanced at it the way you'd glance at a flyer somebody handed you on the street. What is this? Batch records. The concrete on your load-bearing columns isn't rated for this climate. It's going to crack from the inside once the ground freezes hard, and when it goes, it's not going to go quietly. For a second something moved behind his eyes. I want to believe it was fear, even if it was only fear of being caught. Then it was gone, replaced by that easy, practiced smile he wore for cameras. You went digging through my supply records. I checked a crack with a loupe. Everything after that just confirmed what my hands already knew. He laughed, short and sharp, and pushed the folder an inch back toward me with 2 fingers, like it might be contagious. You're a retired inspector with a hobby, Gideon. This is modern polymer-modified aggregate technology. You wouldn't recognize it because it didn't exist when you were still doing this for a living. The world's moved on. The world hasn't moved on from physics. Physics. He said the word like it amused him. You know what's actually going to happen here? Nothing. Because in 6 weeks that tower's got exterior cladding on it and marketing photos in every real estate magazine in this city, and in 8 months I've got 41 units closed and 41 deposits I can finally stop sweating over. Nobody's pulling anything out. Certainly not because an old man with a magnifying glass had a feeling. It's not a feeling. It's a hollow knock where there shouldn't be one. Then I guess, he said, standing, buttoning his coat, you better hope you're wrong. I went back 3 days later, because I couldn't leave it there. I found him at the site trailer and I didn't come alone in my thinking this time. I'd decided if he wouldn't listen to me, maybe he'd listen in front of someone whose job depended on getting it right. His site superintendent, a heavy-set man named Marcus Deacon who'd shaken my hand like he meant it the first time we met, was going over schedules at the folding table when I walked in. Marcus, I said, can I show you something on column B14? Julian was on his feet before I finished the sentence. Don't. He's the one signing off on structural integrity every morning, Julian. He should know what he's signing. Marcus looked between us, caught in the middle of something he clearly hadn't asked to be part of. Mr. Hargrove? It's nothing, Julian said, too fast. Family stuff. Gideon here used to be an inspector, thinks he still is one. He put a hand on Marcus's shoulder, steering him gently back toward the schedule. We've got a concrete engineer signed off on every pour, Marcus. Dr. Whitfield reviewed the mix personally. You want to go double-check 30 years at industry standard against my wife's uncle's magnifying glass, be my guest, but I'd rather you focus on getting the cladding crew scheduled before the ground freezes solid. Marcus gave me an apologetic look and went back to his clipboard, and I understood then that Julian had already built himself a wall of paper, a hired engineer's signature, a superintendent who trusted the paperwork over an old man's hands, thick enough that the truth would bounce right off it unless I found a way through that nobody could argue with. Julian followed me out to the gate. The wind off the river cut sideways through the site, and he had to raise his voice over it. You listen to me. You go to the city with this, you go to the Safety Codes Council, whatever you're thinking of doing, you understand what happens to Clara? Don't, I said. No, you don't. Every asset that girl has, the condo, her half of our joint account, the rest we started for the baby she doesn't even know I know she's hoping for, every bit of it is cross-collateralized against this project. I did that on paper 8 months ago because the Toronto money wanted skin in the game from the whole family, not just me. You blow this up, you're not just ending my company. You're putting your niece and her unborn kid out on the street in January. So before you play hero, old man, you ask yourself who actually pays for it. He walked back toward the trailer without waiting for an answer, and I stood there at the gate with the wind finding every gap in my parka, because he was right about one thing. I hadn't known about the rest. I hadn't known Clara was already dreaming that far ahead. And now I did. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the wooden chair by the window in my kitchen with the lamp off, holding a photograph I keep in the junk drawer, Clara at 7 years old, gap-toothed, sitting on my shoulders at the stampede with cotton candy smeared across her cheek, my sister laughing somewhere just out of frame. If I sent that folder to the Safety Codes Council, Julian would be finished. Charges, most likely. The company would collapse, and everything he'd told me about Clara's finances would come crashing down with it, the condo, the account, maybe even that rest for a grandchild I hadn't been told about yet. She might never forgive me. She might spend the rest of her life believing her own uncle had destroyed her family out of some petty grudge over a microphone and a room full of strangers laughing at him. But I kept coming back to the sound. That hollow knock under my knuckle, the one that meant the inside of that column was already lying to everyone standing near it. 41 units. 200, maybe 300 people sleeping in that building on the worst night of a Calgary winter, trusting a wall they'd never once thought to question. I turned the brass loop over and over in my hand until the metal warmed against my palm, and somewhere around 4 in the morning I stopped weighing Clara's condo against strangers' lives, because it was never really a fair fight to begin with. It just felt like one, sitting alone in the dark. I drove to the post office on McLeod Trail before it opened, waited in my idling truck with the heater ticking, and when the doors finally unlocked I mailed the whole file, batch records, waltz notes, photographs from my own loop, to the Alberta Safety Codes Council, and signed, return address left blank. I stood at the counter afterward longer than I needed to, watching the clerk drop it in the outgoing bin like it was nothing, like it wasn't a niece's marriage and a stranger's unborn grandchild and possibly 300 lives all sealed inside one plain manila envelope. 48 hours later, I put on a suit I hadn't worn since my sister's funeral and walked into that ballroom to watch Julian celebrate the topping out of a tower I already knew was rotten at the root, and when he pointed that microphone at me and called me a fossil, I didn't feel a single flicker of anger. I felt something closer to grief, because I already knew what was coming for him, and some small, stupid part of me still didn't want it to. It came fast. 3 days after the party, a stop work order landed on the site before the morning crew had even finished their coffee. I heard about it the way most of Calgary did, a knock at my own door, except mine came from Clara, pale and shaking, phone in her hand, before the city news vans had even parked outside the Beltline sales office. Government inspectors moved through the site with core sampling rigs, pulling cylindrical plugs of concrete out of the lower columns one after another, each one labeled, bad, and driven off in an unmarked van. By that afternoon, 2 of the Toronto lenders had already issued statements distancing themselves from the project. By evening, a third had frozen all remaining disbursements outright. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the radio on low, listening to a local business reporter describe irregularities under investigation at a high-profile downtown development, and somewhere across the city, in an office with his name still bolted to the lobby wall, Julian Hargrove was watching everything he'd built with borrowed money and cut corners begin, one phone call at a time, to come apart. The full engineering report came back 11 days later, and it didn't leave anything to interpretation. The columns on the lower parking level failed CSA cold weather standards outright, and 3 of the 11 core samples showed early microfracturing consistent with a freeze-thaw cycle that hadn't even properly started yet. Hargrove Developments filed for bankruptcy protection within the month. Julian himself was facing charges under the province's Building Code Act, fraud among them, and the business press had already started running his headshot next to words like disgraced and reckless. I didn't watch the news coverage close. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside that concrete before anyone with a microphone did. He came to my house on a Tuesday evening, no coat, no gloves, like he'd left in too much of a hurry to remember it was -18 outside. I heard the truck door slam before I heard the knock, and by the time I opened it he was already talking. You did this. His voice cracked somewhere in the middle of it, not from cold. 15 years I spent building something, Gideon. 15 years, and you tore it down because I embarrassed you in front of a room full of people at a party. Come in before you freeze, I said, and stepped back from the door. He didn't sit. He stood in my kitchen with his hands shaking, whether from anger or from the temperature I couldn't say, and he slammed his palm flat on my table hard enough to rattle the sugar bowl. You had no right. You're not an inspector anymore. You're nobody. You had no legal standing to go digging through my supply chain, and you sent it in anonymous because you knew you didn't have the guts to put your name on it. I put my name on it the day I looked through that loop at column B14, I said. The envelope didn't need my signature. The concrete already told the whole story. This was never about the building. He was almost shouting now. This was about that stage. About me calling you a fossil in front of your niece's friends. You couldn't stand it, so you found a way to ruin me for it. I went to the sideboard by the window, where the brass loop hangs on its cord when I'm not wearing it, and I picked it up along with a chunk of broken concrete I'd kept in a small tin since the day I first knocked on that column, gray, unremarkable, the kind of thing nobody looks at twice. I set both of them on the table between us. I didn't destroy your company, Julian. I kept my voice level, the way I'd keep it standing over a beam that was about to fail, because raising it never made a crack close faster. Water gets into a flaw like this one, freezes, and it expands with a force that'll split solid rock, let alone a bad pour cut with cheap aggregate. That's not opinion. That's physics doing exactly what it's always done in this province, every winter, to every structure that isn't built to survive it. I didn't do that to your building. Alberta did that to your building, the same as it's done to bridges and driveways and foundations for 100 years before either of us was born. All I did was read the weather report before you did. He stared at the piece of concrete on my table like it might answer him back. For a long moment he didn't say anything at all, and something in his face went from fury to something smaller, more tired, closer to a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. Then he turned and left without another word, and I heard his truck pull away too fast down a street that had ice under the snow. Clara came 4 days after that, on a Saturday afternoon, and she didn't call ahead the way she usually does. I opened the door and found her standing on the step in her coat, unbuttoned, tears already frozen at the corners of her eyes from the walk up my driveway. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice wasn't angry. It was worse than angry, it was hollowed out, the sound of someone who'd spent days going over every conversation we'd ever had, looking for the moment I should have warned her and didn't. You knew. You knew for weeks, and you let me stand next to him at that party, let me find out from a lawyer instead of from my own uncle. I brought her inside and sat her down at the same table where Julian had slammed his hand 4 days earlier, and I made her tea the way I always have, too strong, the way her mother used to like it. I took the loop from around my neck and set it in front of her, the brass coal from the walk from the sideboard. There are cracks you only see when you're the one holding the light, I said. If I'd come to you first, told you what I found before I was certain, you'd have had an impossible choice between the man you married and the uncle who raised you. You'd have chosen him. Not because you're foolish, Clara, because that's what love does, it defends first and asks questions later, and I've watched you do it your whole life, same as your mother did. This wasn't a family disagreement I could let you referee. It was concrete and water and gravity, and none of those things care who you love. She was quiet for a long time, turning the loop over in her fingers the way I used to when she was small enough to sit on my knee and ask what it was for. You could have lost me over this, she finally said. I know. You did it anyway. I did it anyway. She put her head down on my shoulder then, the way she hadn't done since she was maybe 12 years old, and she cried in a way that sounded less like grief for Julian and more like the particular exhaustion of finally setting something down she'd been carrying without knowing its full weight. I didn't say anything else. I just kept my hand flat between her shoulder blades, the same spot I'd rested it the day we buried her mother, and let her stay there as long as she needed. Winter loosened its grip the way it always does eventually, grudgingly, sometime around the middle of April, ice giving way to mud giving way finally to green along the Bow River pathway behind my house. Clara moved in with me while the divorce worked its way through the courts, and she took a small bookkeeping job downtown, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that let her rebuild slowly instead of all at once. Julian's case was still working through the system by then, plea discussions dragging on the way they do, but that had stopped being the thing that mattered most in my house. What mattered was the small, round belly Clara carried into spring, and the crib. It had been my sister's, then Clara's, stored in pieces in my garage rafters for over 30 years, the oak gone dry and dull with age. On a warm afternoon in late April, I brought it down piece by piece and set it up on the front porch, sanding the joints, tightening screws that had loosened decades ago, working with the kind of patience I used to give to columns that would carry the weight of entire buildings. Clara sat on the porch steps in the sun with a glass of lemonade, watching me the way she used to watch me check a beam when she was a girl, curious and a little bored and comfortable all at once. "You still do that," she said, nodding at my hands. I didn't answer right away. I ran my thumb along the last rail I'd fitted into place, checking the seam, and then I brought my index finger, the same finger, thick-knuckled, the same one I'd tapped twice on a ballroom table months earlier, down against the oak rail of the crib. It gave back a solid, tight, honest sound, dense and unhollow, nothing hiding underneath it. I lifted the brass-rimmed loop from around my neck and bent close, running the glass slowly along every joint until I reached the last one, the corner post where the rail met the frame, and I held it there a long moment in the afternoon light. No cracks. No hollow places waiting for winter to find them. Just old wood, sound all the way through, ready to hold whatever we were about to trust it with. Some nights I still wake up around 3 in the morning, the way I did the winter all of this happened, and for a few seconds before I remember where I am, I'm back at that folding table in the construction trailer, smelling burnt Tim Hortons coffee and rebar dust, listening for a sound under my own knuckle. I don't think that ever fully leaves a man. 31 years of putting my ear to buildings other people trusted with their lives teaches you that quiet can lie just as easily as noise can, and once you've learned to hear the difference, you don't stop hearing it, not even in a house with a crib on the porch and a granddaughter I haven't met yet asleep somewhere inside her mother. I think about Julian sometimes, more than I expected to. Not with the satisfaction I imagined I might feel, back when I was still deciding whether to mail that envelope. Mostly I think about how certain he was, standing in that coffee shop on 4th Street, that the world had moved past men like me, as if a hairline crack cares what decade it opened in, as if -20 in January reads a balance sheet before it goes looking for a weakness to get inside of. He wasn't wrong that the world changes. He was wrong about what doesn't. Clara asked me once, not long after she moved back in, whether I'd have sent that folder if I'd known everything it would cost us both. I told her the truth, which is that I didn't know, not fully, not the night I stood at that post office counter with the engine running. I only knew what my hand already knew, tapping oak, tapping a supporting beam, tapping the same 2 knocks I'd given 1,000 structures before this one, waiting to hear whether what's underneath is going to hold. I check that crib rail most mornings now, out of habit more than worry, the loop cold against my palm before the sun's warmed it, and it always gives back the same tight, solid knock it gave the day I finished it. One day, years from now, some small hand is going to grip that same rail to pull itself upright for the first time, and it won't know a single thing about concrete, or Julian, or a ballroom full of people laughing at an old man in a parka. It will just know the wood held.